Thank you so much, John. That was so sweet. And thank you to the board and the staff of the Hickory Art Museum for inviting me to be here with you tonight. I am so honored and very happy to share Susana's story with you even further. After a day in her cotton fields, then tending her family's needs in a two-room house with no running water or electricity, Susana Hunter sat down to lavish her creativity on quilt making. On-the-fly inspiration rather than tradition guided this African-American farm wife's creations. Susana joyfully turned the materials available to her, worn clothing and fabric scraps, into eye-catching quilts. Quilts like Susana's are pieced in a design-as-you-go improvisational style. Created from the 1930s to the 1970s, they are a reflection of her life in Wilcox County, Alabama. Quilts like Susana's are part of a make-do culture, one of survival and self-sufficiency in impoverished communities in the rural South. In these settings, nothing went to waste. Through the lens of one woman's quilts and history, I invite you into Susana's world to explore a style of quilt making that emerges out of a dearth of outside influences, and one inspired by a wealth of inner creativity. Susana Hunter was born in Wilcox County in 1912 and was one of at least 11 children. She married Julius Hunter when she was 17, and they raised two kids, Lily Bell and Paul, and also grandson Tommy. For the Hunters and other African-American families, life in the Jim Crow South meant hard work and few resources. The Hunters lived in this house from about 1940 to 1970. It had no central heat, indoor plumbing, or electricity. The walls were one plank thick with no insulation. A very small fireplace provided warmth, but not nearly enough. So to keep out the cold that came through the cracks between the board siding, the Hunters covered the inside walls with newspapers and magazine pages. To help illustrate aspects of Susana's life, I have included some images from the Henry Ford Susana Hunter exhibit in some of my slides. To get water, the Hunters carried it from a spring about a half a mile from their home. They lit their house with kerosene lamps, and the outside world came to them through a battery-powered radio used very sparingly and a wind-up phonograph. The Hunters, like other poor rural families, didn't spend scarce cash on what they could make for themselves. Susana and Julius Hunter were tenant farmers. They didn't own the land. They plowed, planted, and harvested. Cotton was their cash crop, and Susana helped with the farm work, hoeing fields, milking cows, feeding chickens, and tending the family's vegetable garden. Tenant farmers had to be very resourceful, and there was very little chance for financial independence or security. In a place where people had to walk most everywhere they wanted to go and where nobody had telephones, close personal ties to family and community enriched the Hunter family's lives. For people who worked hard all week on scattered farms, Sunday brought the welcome opportunity to go to church, the center of community life. Susana Hunter served as an usher and sang in the choir at Little Rock Missionary Baptist Church, half a mile from her home. And like her neighbors, Susana wore her best clothes to church. In 2006, the Henry Ford had the opportunity to acquire 30 of Susana's quilts from her grandson Tommy and his family. Many quilts come into museum collections with the identity of the maker lost to memory, but Susana's quilts didn't. Not only were we able to acquire Susana's quilts, we had the extraordinary and often rare opportunity to document her story. Susana's family generously made it possible for me to see a window into her world and the rich context from which her quilts had sprung. They gave us objects from the Hunter home, including Susana's scissors and her quilting frame, as well as household goods. Common objects, perhaps, but this was her stuff. Carefully selected, the objects symbolize various aspects of Susana's life. Though Susana had died at age 92 in 2005 and couldn't talk with me about her life and her quilts, her family and friends could. I interviewed grandson Tommy and granddaughter-in-law Susie in Mobile and her son Paul in Cincinnati, as well as other family and friends. And now I'd like to show you two excerpts from Tommy's interviews.
My grandmother, she always did quilt during the winter time. When it was cold, she couldn't do no farming. She'd get her quilts together. She'd beat that cotton, beat the seeds out of that cotton, put the pan on the floor, and then she'd put the quilting frames up into the ceiling, and then she would start quilting most of the time. I said, when my grandmother would decide on a pattern, she would just sit there and make the top of the quilt. She would start sewing, and when it ended up, she would have patterns all over the place. She just do it out of her head. Well, my grandmother never would want one quilt. She never would want both quilts alike. She didn't want no pattern alike. She would try and always make the pattern different. Even the quilting line would be different. Have a large quilting line, a small, a large and a small. My grandmother, we keep warm with her because the house wasn't sufficient to keep you warm. So my grandmother had enough quilts to keep everybody warm now.
How many did that take at a cold night?
On a real cold night, you had to put something like 4 or 5 on it. I couldn't even tumble in the bed.
I also had the opportunity to visit the home where Susana had made many of the quilts, and now we'd like you to visit it as well through this video. Might take a couple seconds for this to come up.
Here. 25 in the house, the number in the house. All the houses in the country had a number. So my aunt's house was number 30. And I forget what all the other houses were, but I know ours was number 25.
That's what you wrote up there in chalk? Or crayon? Or
Crayon.
Crayon? I guess that's why we survived. Now, was the house ever painted?
The house never been painted.
It's always been just
All
exposed wood.
exposed wood.
And the porch was built at the same time as the house?
The porch being rebuilt because the cedar posts wasn't here when I was here. They had 4 poles here originally built, but later on my grandfather put the cedar posts up. Because the 4 poles they ride down.
Now, how many rooms in the house?
2 rooms in the house.
And tell me about the opening. Why do you have 2 doors here?
Well, the opening on the right side is where we're going with the chimney after the house. That's the main entrance of the house. The other bedroom is usually we come out of that bedroom. That bedroom, a kitchen was later on built behind the second bedroom.
Is one, which one do you consider the primary entrance? Which would most people go
The primary entrance would be the door to the right of the chimney.
right there? And did you have swing doors, or was this it?
There was screen doors on both doors,
Both doors.
and all windows. That's why you see the latches on the outside of the face of the door.
Tell me about the chain over here.
The chain on the door over here, you have to make, every time you get ready to lock the door, you have to reach your hand on the inside of the door, pull the door through, put the chain through the door hole, and bring the lock out and lock both ends of the chain.
And, this here,
The latch on the facing and outside of the door was the screen door latch. We close the screen door, try the latch.
okay, why don't we go inside? We just have come into the left side of the house, the left room, which is the bedroom, is that
That's
correct?
the left side of the bedroom.
And tell me about the paper on the wall.
Paper on the wall was original. My grandmother used the paper on the wall from old books, newspapers, and every time the paper would get old, every once or twice a year, she would replastic over the existing paper.
And what would you use to do this?
She would use, she mixed, for the plastic paper, she would use flour with warm water and make a plastic, put it on the back of the paper, stick it on the wall, and it would hold just like glue.
Would that keep it pretty warm in here?
Keep it warm.
Yeah.
Because the bowl wasn't really tight together. She'd always had to keep the paper on the wall to keep it warm in the house.
Now, whose room was this?
This room right here was my grandfather and my grandmother.
And did they use it for anything besides sleeping, or?
The only thing they used for this room was sleep. The only thing they do in this room was sleeping because there was no heat in here. The heat was in the front room on the right side of the house with the chimney door. Well, no heat in the back side of the house in the second room.
Now, did you use, there's a floor or ceiling, and what would be an attic or crawl space? Would they ever do anything or put anything up there or use that for anything?
We had a hole in the left side of the room for the door pin, but we never did put anything up in the ceiling.
Was there a ladder there?
Well, no ladder, we just had to get a box or something. Just try if we want to look up in there. We never did go up in there and put it in there.
Now, tell me about the shutter window. Was there a screen for this? Or
We have a screen on all the windows. It's on the outside.
on the outside? Screen was on the
Screen
outside.
on the outside.
And you've got a door back there. Is that original to the house?
The back door was original to the house. And afterwards, when they added in fact, the back door was the door that would go into the kitchen, the small kitchen. And later on, my grandmother and grandfather, they added extension onto the kitchen. But that was originally the back door.
That was originally the back door.
Yes.
And that addition no longer exists. That's been pulled down or fallen down. Why don't we go into through the door here in the center wall and in the other room. Well, tell me a little about this room. How was it used, and who used it? Who slept here? That sort of thing.
This room right here was where I slept. My bed was over in the corner. The shimper roll in the back of it. And my, grandmother just always put in this room because there was just only one bed in this room. It was two beds in the other room. She always kept one bed in this room. This way she didn't make a quilt there.
Is there anything in here that survives that shows maybe how she used this room to hang her quilts?
Well, they still have the staples and the wire hanging from the ceiling. It's full. Which you hang the wooden string down to the wooden rail so that form make a quilt out of it. And then she roll the quilts back up in the ceiling and tie them to the hooks, the staples in the ceiling.
That is the house that Susana and her family lived in until about 1970, the house where she raised her kids, and the house where she made most of the quilts. At this time, when we did this interview, the home had been not lived in for about 35 years. So, well, these interviews that we were able to do were absolutely key. They painted a picture of a joyful and spunky and generous woman who worked hard and expressed her creativity in quilt making. Susana Hunter truly loved to make quilts. She made over 100 in her lifetime, each of them unique. Susana's quiet, hard-working husband, Julius, is said to have told his wife, "You quilt too much. You just quilt too much." So, you know, this gives you an idea of what a passionate woman she was about quilting. Now, these quilts, as you heard, were critical to survival in impoverished areas of the rural South. They were often provided the only means of protection against the cold in these inadequately heated houses. It really wasn't uncommon, from what I've heard, for you to have 7 quilts piled on these beds to create enough warmth. So making your own bed covers out of whatever materials were at hand meant that a family didn't have to spend scarce cash to buy blankets. Since Susana's family was smaller than most, fewer quilts were required to warm her family. But Susana was clearly passionate about quilt making. She was absolutely driven to create. And Susana's art added splashes of color to the beds in the unadorned living space and were a cheerful kaleidoscope of vivid pattern and design against the newspaper-covered walls. Now, making improvisational quilts, they involve a less structured approach to design, but they require a continual stream of creativity. The quilter usually made up the pattern as she sewed, fashioning an attractive whole out of whatever materials happened to be available at the time. As Susana's son Paul commented, Susana would just get that material and get to stitching it. And details of construction were not important. It was the overall visual impact that mattered. This type of creative recycling was more than just a means of survival. For many of these quilters, it was a matter of pride to be able to make something pretty out of nothing. Improvisational quilts are found among both blacks and whites in poorer, more isolated pockets of the rural South, including Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Improvisational quilts gained national attention through exhibitions a number of years ago of quilts made in Gee's Bend, which is another isolated pocket in Wilcox County, about 25 miles away from where Susana lived, and a place she probably never likely visited. In these environments, people had fewer resources and less opportunity to be exposed to design ideas from the outside world. Lack of cash and illiteracy meant less access to design ideas printed in newspapers or magazines. But these constraints left quilters like Susana Hunter free to use their imaginations, unencumbered by standardized design or commercial influences. Are these improvisational quilts full of African symbolism? Are they tangible vestiges of the maker's ancestral heritage, as has been suggested by some? Visitor comments that we gleaned during this Henry Ford Susana Hunter's exhibit support the idea that improvisational quilt design extends across many cultures and backgrounds. A number of our visitors commented that their poor white relatives also made such quilts. One visitor remarked on the similarity between the lives of black and white southern sharecroppers, while another visitor recalled similar bed coverings in her native India, noting thoughtfully, perhaps people aren't so different after all. Many of these improvisational quilts have not survived. They were worn out because, after all, they were made to be used. And worn quilts were sometimes burned. The smoke from the smoldering quilts helped keep the mosquitoes away during hot Alabama summers. Okay. Improvisational quilts are characterized by asymmetry, bold patterns, vibrant colors, large shapes, and multiple patterning. And these qualities often give these quilts an abstract feel that resembles modern art. Now, many improvisational quilts were made of strip construction, Individual pieces were sewn together and then the strips arranged next to each other in a pleasing design. Strip quilts offered a practical way to use fabric remnants to stitch up bed covers quickly, while providing almost instant gratification to quilters who couldn't wait to see how the color and fabric choices worked out. The large-scale piecing and bold patterns were influenced by utility. Sewing together large pieces of fabric didn't take as much time as cutting fabric into small pieces and then sewing them together. Now, some quilters used traditional design ideas as a starting point, and then they created their own expressions of the designs. One of the most popular patterns for Southern black quilters was called pigpen or housetop. And it's a center square or rectangle bordered by strips forming larger and larger rectangles. And for any quilters in the crowd, you might notice that the pattern is similar to traditional patterns called log cabin and courthouse steps. Susana turned her husband Julius's worn flannel shirts and denim jeans into work clothes quilts. The front of this quilt is pieced from the worn denim overalls and the work flannel shirts, and the backing is made from mule feed sacks. Mules were often used to pull the farmer's plow, even this late in time. So this quilt could really be an icon of the Southern tenant farmer. Susana planned this understated yet sophisticated design well, with strategically using something I call pocket shadows, created when she removed the pockets from the faded clothing to add visual interest to her design. And the sacking Susana used in her quilts reflected the Hunter family's rural life. On the back of the quilt at the left are chicken feed sacks and salt sacks. Salt was used for preserving pork after the Hunters slaughtered their hogs each fall. The back of the quilt on the right is made from cabin home cornmeal sacks. Bread and grits made from cornmeal were common foods on Southern tables. Some sacking, like the cabin home cornmeal sack shown here, came with instructions on how to wash the printing ink out so that the sacking material could be reused to make clothing, quilts, towels, or bed sheets. But for this quilt, Susana playfully chose to include the Southern Daisy printed logo as part of her quilt design. Quilt makers often used blankets, bedspreads, and other household textiles in their quilts. Susana Hunter used a plaid cotton flannel blanket for the backing on this quilt. And Susana appears to have used an older quilt as the batting inside this quilt, the middle layer that gives the warmth. And it wasn't uncommon to see worn quilts repurposed in this way. A range of fabrics make up Susana's palette, including cotton prints, worn denim jeans, flannel work shirts, seed and bead sacks, fragments of bedspreads, taffetas, corduroy, and rayon. Susana rarely bought new fabric for her quilts. People who knew a gifted quilter might give her fabric scraps or worn clothing. And in fact, Susana's mother-in-law was a dressmaker, and she would give her fabric scraps left from the dresses that she made for other people. And in the 1950s, bags of scraps could be purchased from the Southern textile mills and clothing manufacturers in the South. Like other rural quilters, Susana Hunter made her own quilt batting, the inner filling that provided the warmth in the quilt. She used leftover cotton from her family's cotton crop, and she or her children and grandchildren would beat the raw cotton to flatten it out and remove the seeds and other debris from the cotton. Homemade cotton batting is often bulky, and it makes it difficult to create tiny, even little stitches when you're doing the quilting that stitches the layers of the quilt together. But tiny decorative stitching wasn't important or necessarily valued by these quilt makers. 3 to 4 stitches per inch held the layers of these quilts together, and the thread was often heavier and not very expensive. Quilters didn't bury their knots in the batting so that you couldn't see them. The knots were left exposed either on the top or bottom of the quilt, depending on the preference of the quilt maker. And back stitches were exposed as well when tying off a row. They would stitch, back stitch, and just cut it, and they'd leave the tails there. And if you look on Susana's quilts, you'll be able to see lines where the width of the quilt frame showed where she was quilting and then tying off. Quilting patterns found on these quilts include right angle quilting and fan or elbow quilting. The curves of the fan quilting could be traced on the swing of an arm, pivoting the elbow. And so there's no templates to mark the quilting pattern that was needed. And while piecing was often an individual task, quilting was often done in groups of 3 or more to get the work done as well as enjoy each other's company. In the early days, Susana often quilted with her sisters Agnes, Mary, and Jenny. Later, she appears to have quilted alone. And it may be that fewer people were actively quilting or had moved to the city by this time. And her grandson Tommy said she was rather particular about how the quilting was done on her quilts. Improvisation and resourcefulness were woven, subtly and not so subtly, throughout Susana Hunter's everyday world. It was in her quilts, in the useful things she made for her family, and in the hymns she sang in the church choir. Author and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston has described this music heard in African American churches throughout the South in this way. Each singing of the piece is a new creation. The congregation is bound by no rules. No 2 times singing is alike, so that we must consider the rendition of a song not as a final thing, but as a mood. It wouldn't be the same thing next Sunday. These same words could be used to describe the improvisational quilts made by Susana Hunter and by so many women like her. For hundreds of years, women have expressed their artistic impulses through fabric and thread. Yet, creativity isn't dependent on having a choice of new materials or access to a wide range of outside design influences. Sometimes, using what is at hand and a willingness to design as you go is part of the challenge of creating something lovely and unique. Thank you very much.